When wealth becomes a prison and innocence turns to defiance, sometimes it takes the wisdom of an unlikely hero to unlock the chains we cannot see. For 2 long years, 8-year-old Daniel refused to wear a single piece of clothing, turning his father's pristine mansion into a battleground of wills. Psychiatrists failed. Behavioral specialists threw up their hands. But a humble housekeeper named Rosa carried a secret weapon that no amount of money could buy, a story from her own childhood that would shatter the walls of shame and bring a lost boy back to the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Montgomery estate sat like a crown jewel on the hillside overlooking Riverside County, its white columns gleaming in the California sun like teeth in a permanent smile. The gardens were immaculate, maintained by a team of 6 groundskeepers who worked in choreographed silence. The marble floors inside reflected the chandelier light with such clarity that visitors often felt they were walking on mirrors. Everything about the Montgomery home screamed perfection, control, and untouchable wealth. Everything except the second-floor west wing, where an 8-year-old boy named Daniel Montgomery had staged the longest, most bewildering protest anyone in the household had ever witnessed. For 732 days, Daniel had refused to wear clothes. Not a shirt. Not pants. Not even underwear or socks. He would tear them off the moment anyone tried to dress him, his small face set in an expression of such fierce determination that it unnerved even the most seasoned members of the household staff. The boy was not being playful or silly. There was no giggling, no childish mischief in his eyes. His refusal was absolute, almost ritualistic in its intensity. He would rip buttons, shred fabric, and once, memorably, he had climbed out onto the balcony ledge in January wearing nothing but his own stubborn will, forcing his terrified nanny to coax him back inside with promises she had no authority to make. Marcus Montgomery, Daniel's father, was a man who had built an empire on predictability. He owned the 3rd largest commercial real estate development company in the western United States. His buildings rose from city centers like monuments to his vision. He negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions with a handshake and a cold smile. He had weathered economic crashes, hostile takeovers, and cutthroat competitors without breaking a sweat. But his own son, a small boy who weighed barely 50 pounds, had brought him to his knees in a way no business rival ever could. Marcus was a tall man with silver threading through his dark hair, giving him a distinguished look that women found magnetic and business partners found intimidating. His jaw was square, his posture military straight, and his eyes were a pale gray that seemed to calculate the value of everything they observed. He wore custom Italian suits that cost more than most people earned in 3 months, and his watches rotated with his mood, each one worth enough to buy a luxury car. He was handsome in the way that power makes men handsome, with an aura of command that preceded him into every room. But in the presence of his naked, defiant son, all that power drained away like water through a sieve. Daniel's mother, Victoria, had died 3 years ago in a riding accident on the estate grounds. She had been an accomplished equestrian, graceful and fearless, and her death had been sudden and brutal. Her horse had spooked at something, perhaps a snake or a shadow, and she had been thrown against a fence post. The impact had been fatal. Daniel, who was 5 at the time, had not witnessed the accident, but he had been the one to find her empty riding boots in the mudroom that evening, still caked with dirt and smelling of leather and hay. No one had thought to hide them. No one had prepared him. He had simply wandered into the mudroom looking for his mother, and instead found those boots, standing at attention like soldiers waiting for orders that would never come. The funeral had been enormous, a spectacle of grief attended by politicians, celebrities, and business titans. Daniel had sat in the front row of the cathedral wearing a small black suit, his face expressionless, his hands folded in his lap. He had not cried. He had not spoken. He had simply stared at the enormous photograph of his mother that dominated the altar, her smile frozen in time, her eyes forever kind and unreachable. For a year after Victoria's death, Daniel had been what the grief counselors called appropriately subdued. He went to school, he did his homework, he ate his meals. He was quieter than before, certainly, and he no longer laughed at cartoons or asked for bedtime stories, but he functioned. Marcus, drowning in his own grief and buried under the demands of running his company, had been grateful for his son's composure. He had hired the best therapists, enrolled Daniel in a prestigious private academy, and assumed that time and professional help would heal what was broken. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning 2 years ago, everything had changed. Daniel's nanny at the time, a stern Swedish woman named Ingrid, had gone to wake him for school. She had found him sitting cross-legged on his bed, completely naked, his pajamas torn into strips and scattered across the floor like confetti. When she had tried to dress him, he had fought her with a ferocity that shocked them both. He had screamed, not words, just raw sound, and had kicked and thrashed until Ingrid had retreated, shaken and defeated. Marcus had been summoned home from an important meeting. He had climbed the stairs to Daniel's room with frustration already clenching his jaw, expecting to find a tantrum he could discipline away with a stern lecture. Instead, he had found his son sitting calmly in the center of his destroyed bedroom, surrounded by shredded clothing, his small body completely exposed, his expression serene and utterly unmovable. "Daniel, what is the meaning of this?" Marcus had demanded, his voice echoing off the walls. Daniel had looked at him with those pale gray eyes, so similar to his own, and said nothing. He had simply folded his hands in his lap and waited. That had been the beginning. In the 2 years since, Marcus had thrown every resource at the problem. He had hired child psychologists, behavioral therapists, and even a controversial specialist from Switzerland who practiced something called embodiment therapy that involved clay and interpretive dance. None of them had made the slightest difference. Daniel would sit through their sessions, silent and naked, occasionally drawing pictures when prompted but never, ever putting on clothes. The drawings themselves had become a source of both fascination and frustration for the specialists. Daniel drew the same things over and over: empty rooms, closed doors, birds in cages, and repeatedly, disturbingly, a small figure standing alone in a vast white space with no walls, no ceiling, and no escape. When asked to explain his drawings, he would simply shake his head and return to his silence. School had become impossible. The academy had been understanding at first, allowing Daniel to attend classes in oversized robes or wrapped in blankets, but eventually the disruption and the discomfort of other parents had forced them to request that Daniel be withdrawn. Marcus had hired private tutors, a rotating cast of educators who would arrive with lesson plans and leave with their dignity in tatters. Daniel was brilliant, they all agreed. He absorbed information like a sponge, his reading level was years ahead of his age, and his mathematical reasoning was almost prodigious. But he would not engage, would not participate, and would absolutely not wear clothes. The house had become a fortress of shame. Marcus stopped hosting dinner parties. He stopped inviting business associates to the estate. He conducted his meetings in the city, in his downtown office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of the harbor. The Montgomery home, once a showcase of success and refined taste, had become a secret he kept locked behind those pristine white columns and manicured hedges. The staff had learned to navigate Daniel's condition with a mixture of professional detachment and private pity. The housekeepers would avert their eyes when they cleaned his room. The cook would leave his meals on a tray outside his door. The groundskeepers knew to stay clear of the west wing windows. But the turnover was constant. Nannies would last a few weeks before the strain of managing a naked, silent child became too much. Tutors would quit after a month. Even the therapists, who were supposed to be trained for difficult cases, would eventually recommend that Marcus seek alternative interventions, which was professional code for "I have no idea what to do with your son." Into this strange, frozen world walked Rosa Delgado. Rosa was 53 years old, a woman of medium height with a solid, comfortable build that spoke of decades of hard work and hearty meals. Her hair was black streaked with silver, which she wore pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was round and warm, with deep laugh lines around her eyes and mouth that made her look like someone who smiled often and meant it. Her hands were strong and calloused, the hands of someone who had scrubbed floors, peeled vegetables, and folded 1,000 loads of laundry. She had emigrated from El Salvador 30 years ago, arriving in California with nothing but a single suitcase, a fierce determination to build a better life, and a work ethic that bordered on superhuman. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had started as a dishwasher in a restaurant, moved up to line cook, then transitioned to housekeeping when she realized the hours were more stable and the work, while physically demanding, was more predictable. She had raised 2 children on her own after her husband had been killed in a construction accident, putting both of them through community college while working 2 jobs. Her daughter was now a registered nurse, and her son was a high school teacher. Rosa was proud of them in the quiet, unshakable way of mothers who have sacrificed everything and asked for nothing in return. She had worked for wealthy families before, but never one quite like the Montgomerys. The previous housekeeper, a nervous woman named Patricia, had quit abruptly, leaving only a brief note that said she was pursuing other opportunities. The staffing agency had been apologetic but firm when they sent Rosa for the interview. "It's a difficult placement," the coordinator had warned her. "The family has some unique challenges. But the pay is excellent, and Mr. Montgomery is fair if you can meet his standards." Rosa had needed the job. Her apartment rent had gone up, and her daughter's husband had been laid off, so Rosa had been helping with their mortgage. She had arrived at the Montgomery estate on a bright Monday morning in early spring, her resume in a folder and her expectations carefully managed. She had seen wealth before. She had seen difficult employers before. She had seen children with behavioral problems before. She thought she was prepared. Marcus Montgomery had interviewed her himself in his study, a room lined with leather-bound books that Rosa suspected had never been read and dominated by a desk the size of a small boat. He had been polite but direct, his pale eyes assessing her with the same calculation he probably used to evaluate real estate investments. "Mrs. Delgado, I need to be frank with you about the nature of this position," he had begun, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. "My son has a condition. It is not medical in the traditional sense, but it is all-consuming. He refuses to wear clothing. He has done so for 2 years. Many people have tried to help him, and all have failed. I am not hiring you to fix him. I am hiring you to maintain the household and to treat him with dignity despite his condition. Can you do that?" Rosa had not blinked. She had raised 2 children through tantrums, through teenage rebellion, through heartbreak and triumph. She had seen poverty, trauma, and resilience. A naked child, while unusual, was not something that would shake her. "Mr. Montgomery," she had said, her accent softening her words but not diminishing their strength, "children do not do things without reason. I do not know your son's reason yet, but I will respect him while I am here. I will keep your home clean, I will cook good meals, and I will treat Daniel like a person, not like a problem. If that is what you need, I can do this job." Something in Marcus's expression had shifted, just slightly. Perhaps it was the way she had used his son's name so naturally, without hesitation or pity. Perhaps it was the calm certainty in her voice. He had hired her on the spot. Rosa's first day had been a study in careful observation. She had moved through the house with quiet efficiency, learning the layout, the rhythms, the unspoken rules. The kitchen was a chef's dream, all stainless steel and marble countertops, but it was clear no one had cooked a real meal there in months. The refrigerator was full of prepared meals from an expensive catering service, sealed in plastic containers with heating instructions. The dining room table, which could seat 16, was covered in a fine layer of dust. The living areas were pristine but lifeless, like rooms in a furniture showroom. She had not seen Daniel that first day. His door had remained closed, and Marcus had instructed her not to disturb him. "He eats when he's hungry," Marcus had explained. "Leave a tray outside his door 3 times a day. He'll take it when he's ready. Do not try to engage him unless he initiates. Do not comment on his appearance. Do not ask him questions. Just leave him be." Rosa had nodded, but privately, she had thought this was a terrible way to treat a child. Leaving him alone like a prisoner in his own home, tiptoeing around him like he was a landmine waiting to explode. But she was new, and she needed this job, so she had followed the rules. On her third day, she finally saw him. She had been carrying a lunch tray up the stairs, a simple meal of chicken soup, crackers, and apple slices. She had learned that Daniel would not eat anything too elaborate, preferring plain foods that required no utensils. As she approached his door, it had suddenly opened, and there he stood. He was small for 8, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and his father's pale gray gaze. His body was thin, almost fragile, his ribs visible beneath pale skin. He stood in the doorway completely naked, as advertised, but what struck Rosa was not his nakedness. It was his eyes. They were old eyes, eyes that had seen too much and decided that the world was not safe. They were eyes that expected nothing and trusted no one. He looked at her, and she looked back, neither of them speaking. Rosa did not gasp. She did not look away. She did not react with shock or pity or discomfort. She simply smiled, the same warm smile she had given her own children 1,000 times, and said, "Hello, Daniel. I am Rosa. I made you soup today. It is still hot, so be careful." She set the tray down on the floor outside his door, as she had been instructed, and then did something no one else had done in 2 years. She sat down on the floor next to it, her back against the wall, and pulled a small paperback book from her apron pocket. Daniel stared at her, clearly confused. "I like to read while I eat my lunch," Rosa explained, opening the book to a dog-eared page. "It makes the food taste better, I think. You can eat yours however you like. I will just be here, reading." She did not look at him. She simply began to read, occasionally turning a page, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed the words. The book was a battered romance novel in Spanish, the kind she bought for 50 cents at the thrift store. It was not great literature, but it was comfort and escape, and right now, sitting in a hallway outside a damaged child's room, she needed both. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Daniel picked up the tray and retreated back into his room. But he did not close the door. He left it open just a crack, and through that crack, Rosa could see him sitting on the floor, eating his soup with his fingers, watching her read. It was the smallest of victories, barely worth noting. But Rosa had raised children. She knew that trust was not built in grand gestures. It was built in moments like this, in the quiet offering of presents without demand, in the patience to sit on a hard floor and read a cheap book while a broken boy decided whether or not you were safe. She read for 20 minutes, until her lunch break was over. Then she stood, brushed off her uniform, and walked back downstairs without a word. The next day, she did the same thing. And the day after that. By the end of the first week, Daniel was leaving his door open wider. By the end of the second week, he had started sitting in the doorway while he ate, watching her openly. He never spoke, and Rosa never pushed. She would simply arrive with his tray, sit down with her book, and read. Sometimes she would hum softly, old songs from her childhood in El Salvador. Sometimes she would comment on her book aloud, to no one in particular. "This woman is being very foolish," she might say, shaking her head. "If a man lies to you once, he will lie to you again. She should know better." Daniel never responded, but Rosa could see him listening, absorbing, considering. Marcus had noticed the change in routine but had not commented. He had hired Rosa to maintain the household, and she was doing that beautifully. The house had never been cleaner, the meals had never been better, and for the first time in months, there was a feeling of life in the estate, not just sterile maintenance but actual warmth. If sitting in a hallway reading trashy novels was part of her method, he was not going to interfere. One morning, 3 weeks into her employment, Rosa arrived at Daniel's door with breakfast and found him sitting in the hallway waiting for her. He had dragged a pillow and a blanket out from his room and had made himself a small nest against the wall opposite where she usually sat. He looked at her expectantly, as if to say, "I am ready for the story now." Rosa smiled and sat down in her usual spot. But today, instead of opening her book, she set it aside and folded her hands in her lap. "Today," she said, "I will tell you a different kind of story. Not from a book, but from my life." Would you like to hear it? Daniel did not respond, but his eyes were locked on hers, and that was answer enough. Rosa took a deep breath, reaching back through decades to a memory she had not shared with anyone in years. It was a painful memory, a shameful one, but as she looked at this small, naked boy sitting in his fortress of defiance, she knew it was time to share it. When I was 9 years old, Rosa began, her voice soft but steady, I lived in a very small village in El Salvador. We were poor, but everyone was poor, so it did not feel strange. We had a small house with a dirt floor and a roof made of tin that would leak when it rained. My mother worked very hard, cleaning houses for the few families in town who had money. My father had left before I was born, so it was just my mother, my 2 brothers, and me. Daniel was listening, his small body very still. We did not have much, but we had enough. Enough food, enough love, enough laughter. But there was one thing we did not have enough of, and that was clothes. My mother could not afford to buy us new things very often. She would mend and patch and make things last as long as possible. My brothers wore the same 2 shirts each, over and over, until they were more holes than fabric. And I had one dress. Just one. It was blue, and my mother had made it for me herself from an old curtain someone had thrown away. I wore it every single day. I would wash it at night and hang it by the fire to dry, and in the morning, I would put it back on. Rosa's voice was steady, but her eyes had gone distant, seeing the past. One day, my dress tore. Not a little tear that could be mended, but a big rip right down the front, from the collar to the hem. I had been climbing a tree, being wild and careless, and I had caught it on a branch. I remember looking down at myself and seeing my whole front exposed, my skin showing through the torn fabric. I was 9 years old, and I felt ashamed in a way I had never felt before. Not because I had been naked, but because I had destroyed the only dress I had. The only thing my mother had been able to give me. Daniel's eyes had widened slightly. Rosa could see recognition flickering there, the understanding that this story was not random. I ran home, crying, holding the dress closed with my hands. My mother was washing clothes outside when I arrived. I showed her what I had done, and I waited for her to be angry. We did not have money for another dress. She had worked so hard to make this one. But my mother did not yell. She did not punish me. She just looked at me with such sadness, and she said, "Rosa, go inside. Do not come out." Rosa's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. So I went inside our small house, and I took off the torn dress, and I sat on my sleeping mat in the corner, and I waited. I waited for hours. I could hear my mother outside, washing, working, and I sat there with nothing to wear, feeling so ashamed that I could not even cry anymore. I thought she would leave me like that, naked and punished, to teach me to be more careful. A tear rolled down Rosa's cheek, but she did not wipe it away. But then, as the sun was setting, my mother came inside. She was carrying something folded in her arms. It was one of her own dresses. She had spent the entire afternoon taking it apart, cutting it down, and sewing it back together to fit me. It was too big still, and the stitches were crooked because she had worked so fast, but it was a dress. She had given me the clothes off her own back, literally, so that I would not have to sit naked and ashamed anymore. Rosa looked directly at Daniel, her eyes full of a compassion that had been earned through suffering. She dressed me herself, and as she buttoned up the back, she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Rosa, clothes are not just cloth. They are armor. They are the way we show the world we are ready to face it. When you are naked, you are telling the world you have given up, that you do not want to fight anymore. But you are my daughter, and you are strong, and you do not give up. So you wear this dress, and you face the world, and you remember that you are never alone." The hallway was silent except for the distant sound of a gardener's mower outside. Rosa leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Daniel, I do not know why you took off your clothes 2 years ago. I do not know what you are protecting yourself from. But I know that you are not bad, and you are not broken. You are a boy who is hurting, and you have found a way to show that hurt to everyone around you without saying a single word. And that is okay. I understand. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small piece of folded fabric. It was a simple handkerchief, white with blue embroidery around the edges. She had brought it from home that morning, knowing somehow that today would be the day she would need it. My mother kept that dress she made me until the day she died. She kept it even though it had no use, even though it was just a reminder of our poverty. She kept it because it was a symbol of something important. It was proof that love can make armor out of scraps. Rosa stood up slowly, her knees creaking slightly from sitting on the hard floor. She placed the handkerchief on the floor between them, a small offering in a vast, empty space. I will leave this here, she said. It belonged to my mother. It is not much, but it is something. When you are ready to face the world again, Daniel, when you are ready to put your armor back on, you will know. And I will be here, waiting, ready to help you button it up. She picked up her book, gave him one last warm smile, and walked down the hallway toward the stairs. Behind her, Daniel sat frozen in his nest of blankets, staring at the small white handkerchief with its delicate blue stitching. For the first time in 732 days, something had cracked in the fortress he had built. It was not much, just a hairline fracture in the wall, but it was there. And in his chest, in a place that had been cold and locked for so long, something very small and very fragile began to warm. The handkerchief remained untouched on the hallway floor for 3 days. Rosa did not move it, did not mention it, did not ask Daniel about it. She simply continued her routine, bringing meals, sitting with her book, sharing small observations about her day. The weather was getting warmer. The roses in the garden were beginning to bloom. She had seen a hummingbird at the feeder that morning, a flash of green and ruby in the early light. On the 4th day, the handkerchief was gone. Rosa noticed its absence immediately but said nothing. She sat in her usual spot, opened her book, and began to read. Daniel emerged from his room as he always did now, wrapped in his blanket, and settled into his nest across from her. But today, there was something different in the way he held himself. His fingers kept fidgeting with the edge of his blanket, and his eyes would dart to Rosa's face and then away, as if he wanted to say something but could not find the words. Rosa read for 10 minutes, then closed her book and looked at him directly. You know, she said conversationally, when my daughter was about your age, she went through a phase where she would only eat white food. Rice, bread, milk, potatoes. Nothing with color. My son thought she was being ridiculous and would tease her about it. But I understood. Sometimes we need to control something, anything, when the world feels too big and too scary. So I let her eat her white food, and after a few months, when she felt safer, she started adding colors back in. First yellow, then orange, then red. It took almost a year, but eventually, she was eating everything again. Daniel was listening intently, his fidgeting hands going still. The point is, Rosa continued, we all have our ways of coping. We all build our walls. And there is no shame in that. But walls that keep pain out also keep love out. And eventually, we have to decide which one we need more. She stood up, brushing invisible dust from her uniform. Your father has a business dinner tonight in the city. He will not be home until late. I am making pozole for dinner, my grandmother's recipe. It is very good. If you want some, I will leave a bowl for you in the kitchen. You can eat it wherever you feel comfortable. She walked downstairs, leaving Daniel sitting in his hallway nest, his mind churning with thoughts he had not allowed himself to think in 2 years. That evening, as Rosa was cleaning up the kitchen after preparing the pozole, she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps. Light, hesitant footsteps on the stairs. She did not turn around. She simply continued washing the large pot she had used for the stew, her movements calm and unhurried. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wrapped in his blanket like a small ghost. He stood there, watching her work. Rosa acknowledged him with a slight nod but did not speak. She had learned that silence could be its own form of welcome. After a long moment, Daniel took 3 steps into the kitchen. Then 3 more. He made his way to the large wooden table in the breakfast nook, the one that overlooked the garden through floor-to-ceiling windows. He climbed onto one of the chairs, arranging his blanket around himself carefully, and sat. Rosa ladled a generous portion of pozole into a bowl, added a spoon, and set it in front of him along with a napkin. She then prepared a bowl for herself and sat down across from him. Not next to him, which might feel intrusive, but across, which allowed for connection without pressure. They ate in companionable silence. Daniel used the spoon, which Rosa noted as significant. For months, he had only eaten with his hands, another form of rejection of civilized norms. But tonight, he was using utensils. He was sitting at a table. He was in a shared space. These were all tiny movements toward rejoining the world. When they had both finished, Rosa collected the bowls and began washing them. Daniel remained at the table, watching her. The kitchen was warm and smelled of hominy, chilies, and oregano. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber. "My mother is gone," Daniel said suddenly, his voice rusty from disuse but clear enough to understand. Rosa's hands stilled in the soapy water, but she did not turn around. She knew instinctively that he needed to say this to her back, not to her face. Eye contact might stop the words from coming. "Yes," Rosa said gently. "I know. I am very sorry. It was my fault." Rosa's heart clenched. There it was. The poison at the center of everything. She dried her hands slowly, carefully, and then turned to face him. Daniel was staring at the table, his small hands gripping the edge of the blanket so tightly his knuckles were white. "Why do you think that?" Rosa asked, her voice soft but steady. "I asked her to take me riding that day," Daniel whispered. "I wanted to go with her. But she said no. She said I had a math test to study for, and she would take me the next weekend instead. I got angry. I told her I hated her. I said she never did anything fun anymore and that she was mean." His voice cracked on the last word. "She left to go riding alone because of what I said. If I had not been mean, if I had just studied for my stupid test, she would not have gone. She would not have fallen. She would still be here." Rosa moved to the table and sat down next to him, close but not touching. She let the weight of his confession settle in the air between them. "Daniel," she said finally, "grief makes us tell ourselves terrible stories. It makes us believe things that are not true because if we can find someone to blame, even ourselves, then the pain makes sense. But your mother's accident was not your fault. You were a child being a child. Children get angry. Children say things they do not mean. That is normal. That is human. But if I had gone with her, if you had gone with her, you might have been hurt too," Rosa interrupted gently but firmly. "Or maybe the horse would have spooked anyway. Or maybe something completely different would have happened. We cannot know. What we do know is that your mother loved you. And she would be heartbroken to see you punishing yourself like this." Daniel's eyes were filling with tears, the first tears Rosa had seen from him. "I took my clothes off because I felt dirty," he said, the words tumbling out now like water through a broken dam. "After the funeral, everyone kept touching me, hugging me, telling me it would be okay. And I felt so dirty, like their hands were leaving marks on me. I wanted to scrub it all off, but even after I showered, I still felt it. So I took off my clothes because at least then I could see my skin. I could see there were no marks. But I still felt dirty. I still feel dirty." Rosa reached out slowly and placed her hand over his, the first physical contact they had shared. Her hand was warm and solid and real. "You are not dirty," she said, each word deliberate and full of conviction. "You are a boy who lost his mother and did not know how to carry that pain. So you tried to shed it like old skin. But pain does not work that way. It lives inside us, and the only way through it is to feel it, to name it, and to let people who care about us help carry it." Daniel looked at her hand covering his, and something in his face began to crumble. The wall, the fortress, the defiance that had kept him protected and isolated for 2 years, began to crack and splinter. A sob broke from his throat, raw and painful, and suddenly he was crying, truly crying, in a way he had not allowed himself to since his mother's death. Rosa pulled him into her arms, blanket and all, and held him while he wept. She did not shush him or tell him it was okay or try to make it stop. She simply held him, one hand on his back and the other cradling his head, and let him release 2 years of bottled anguish. He cried for his mother. He cried for his loneliness. He cried for the weight of guilt he had been carrying. And Rosa held him through all of it, murmuring soft words in Spanish, rocking him slightly the way she had rocked her own children through their nightmares and heartbreaks. When the storm finally passed, Daniel was exhausted, limp in her arms like a rag doll. Rosa carried him upstairs, something she would not have been able to do if he had been a larger child, and laid him gently in his bed. She pulled the covers up over him, tucking the blanket around his shoulders. "Sleep now," she whispered. "Tomorrow is a new day." Daniel's hand shot out from under the covers and grabbed hers. His eyes were red and swollen, but there was a clarity in them that had not been there before. "Will you tell me more stories?" he asked, his voice small and hopeful. "About your mother and the dress?" "I will tell you as many stories as you want," Rosa promised. "I have a whole lifetime of them." He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, he was asleep, his breathing deep and even. Rosa stood watch over him for a long moment, this small wounded boy who had finally begun to let someone in. Then she turned off the light and quietly left the room, leaving the door open just a crack so he would know he was not alone. Downstairs, she heard the front door open. Marcus had returned from his dinner meeting. Rosa met him in the foyer, where he was removing his suit jacket and loosening his tie. He looked exhausted, the weight of his empire pressing down on his shoulders. "How was Daniel today?" he asked, the same question he asked every evening, usually without much hope in his voice. "He spoke to me," Rosa said simply. Marcus froze, his jacket halfway off his arm. He stared at her as if she had just announced that the sun had risen in the west. "He what?" "He came downstairs for dinner. We ate together. And then he told me why he stopped wearing clothes." Marcus's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, hope, fear, and finally, a desperate need to know. "What did he say?" Rosa considered her words carefully. Daniel's confession had been sacred, a trust she would not violate lightly. But his father needed to understand, needed to help carry this burden. "He believes your wife's death was his fault," Rosa said gently. "He had an argument with her the day she died. He said things he regrets. And he has been punishing himself ever since." Marcus's face drained of color. He stumbled to the nearby bench and sat down heavily, his head falling into his hands. "Oh God," he whispered. "I never knew. He never said anything. I thought he was just acting out. I thought he was angry at me for not being there enough." "Children rarely tell us what they really need," Rosa said, sitting down beside him. "They show us instead, in ways we often do not understand. Daniel showed you his pain the only way he knew how." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "What do I do? How do I fix this?" "You cannot fix it alone," Rosa said. "But you can help. You can tell him the truth about the accident. You can tell him it was not his fault. You can share your own grief with him instead of hiding it away. You can stop treating him like a problem to be solved and start treating him like a son who needs his father." It was a bold thing to say to an employer, especially one as powerful as Marcus Montgomery. Rosa half expected him to bristle, to defend himself, to remind her of her place. Instead, he simply nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his failures. "I have been a terrible father," he said quietly. "You have been a grieving husband," Rosa corrected. "And grief makes us do things we regret. But it is not too late. Daniel is still young. He still needs you. And I think, maybe, you still need him too." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she had been hired. He saw not just a housekeeper but a woman of depth and wisdom, someone who had lived through her own tragedies and emerged with her compassion intact. "Thank you, Rosa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For seeing him. For reaching him. For doing what I could not." "I only opened the door," Rosa said. "You are his father. You are the one who needs to walk through it." That night, Marcus Montgomery did something he had not done in 2 years. He went to his son's room, knocked softly on the door, and entered. Daniel was asleep, his face peaceful in a way Marcus had not seen since before Victoria's death. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to wake him, and simply watched his son breathe. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered into the darkness. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I let you carry this alone. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." He stayed there for over an hour, keeping vigil, before finally retreating to his own room. But something had shifted in the Montgomery house that night, a thawing of the permafrost that had gripped them all for so long. Over the next 2 weeks, a new routine established itself. Rosa continued to bring Daniel his meals, but now he would come downstairs to eat them with her in the kitchen. They would talk, or rather, Rosa would talk and Daniel would listen and occasionally respond. She told him about her children, about her journey from El Salvador, about the small joys and large struggles of her life. She never lectured or moralized. She simply shared her experiences and let him draw his own conclusions. Marcus began joining them for dinner. At first, the meals were awkward, stilted affairs with long silences and careful conversations about neutral topics like the weather or a movie Daniel had watched. But gradually, as the days passed, the conversations became easier. Marcus started asking Daniel about what he had been reading, and Daniel, though still wrapped in his blanket at the table, would answer in short sentences that slowly grew longer. One evening, Marcus finally broached the subject that had been haunting him since his conversation with Rosa. "Daniel," he said, setting down his fork and looking directly at his son, "I need to tell you something about the day your mother died." Daniel went very still, his eyes fixed on his plate. Marcus took a deep breath. "I know you had an argument with her that morning. I know you asked to go riding and she said no. And I know you said some things you wish you could take back." Daniel's hands gripped the edge of the table. "But here's what you need to know. Your mother called me that afternoon, right before she went to the stables. She told me about the argument. And do you know what she said? She laughed. She said, 'Daniel called me mean today.' Can you imagine? Our sweet boy, finally showing some spirit. I was worried he was too good, too compliant. But this is healthy. This is normal. She was not angry with you, Daniel. She was relieved." Daniel looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "She also said," Marcus continued, his voice breaking slightly, "that she was going riding to clear her head so she could figure out a good time to take you that weekend, maybe Saturday morning before your soccer game. She was planning it, Daniel. She was not upset. She was being a parent, balancing responsibilities, and trying to make you happy. That's all." Tears were streaming down Daniel's face. "The accident was just that," Marcus said firmly. "An accident. A horrible, tragic accident that was no one's fault. Not yours, not hers, not mine." Her horse got spooked. "It happens. It is a risk every rider takes. But she loved riding, and she knew that risk, and she accepted it because it brought her joy. You did not cause her death, Daniel. A random, terrible moment of bad luck did." Daniel was sobbing now, his small frame shaking with the force of his grief. But unlike before, when he had cried alone in Rosa's arms, this time his father was there. Marcus came around the table and pulled his son into an embrace that was 2 years overdue. He held him tightly, his own tears falling into Daniel's hair, and for the first time since Victoria's death, they grieved together. Rosa quietly excused herself from the kitchen, giving them privacy. She stood in the hallway, her own eyes damp, and sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever forces in the universe had led her to this family at this exact moment. The breakthrough with Marcus seemed to accelerate Daniel's healing. He began spending more time out of his room, venturing into other parts of the house. He would sit in the library, wrapped in his blanket, reading the books his mother had loved. He would stand at the windows overlooking the garden, watching the birds and squirrels with an interest he had not shown in anything for years. But he still would not wear clothes. Rosa did not push. She knew that healing was not linear, that each person had to move at their own pace. The emotional barriers had begun to fall, but the physical manifestation of his trauma, the refusal to dress, remained stubbornly in place. Then, one morning, everything changed. Marcus had arranged for a specialist to visit, not a therapist or a psychologist but an expert in childhood trauma who came highly recommended by a colleague. Her name was Dr. Sarachan, and unlike the parade of professionals who had tried and failed before, she had a different approach. She spent an hour with Marcus and Rosa before ever meeting Daniel, asking questions about his routines, his interests, his breakthrough moments. When she finally met Daniel, she did not bring notebooks or tablets or recording devices. She brought a deck of cards and asked if he wanted to play Go Fish. Daniel, intrigued despite himself, agreed. They played for an hour in the library, Rosa sitting nearby with her book, providing a sense of safety through her presence. Dr. Chen lost every single game, dramatically and with good humor. She never mentioned Daniel's lack of clothing. She never asked probing questions about his feelings. She simply played cards, laughed at her own terrible luck, and treated him like a normal 8-year-old boy. As the hour was ending, Dr. Chen began packing up her cards. "You know," she said conversationally, "I work with a lot of kids who have been through really hard things. And I have noticed something interesting. The kids who heal the fastest are not the ones who pretend nothing happened. They are the ones who find a way to honor what happened while still moving forward." Daniel was listening, his eyes on the cards in his hands. "Your mom sounds like she was a pretty amazing person," Dr. Chen continued. "From what your dad told me, she loved riding, and she loved adventure, and she was brave. I bet she would not want you to stop being brave just because she's gone." "I'm not brave," Daniel said quietly. "Really?" Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "You have been living naked for 2 years in a house full of people who wanted you to stop. That takes guts. Most kids would have caved to the pressure. But not you. You decided what you needed, and you stuck with it, even when it was hard. That is the definition of brave." Daniel blinked, clearly not having thought about it that way before. "But here is the thing about bravery," Dr. Chen said, leaning forward slightly. "The bravest thing is not doing what is comfortable. It is doing what is hard because you know it is right. You needed to be naked for a while, to feel in control of something, to work through your feelings. And that was okay. But at some point, being brave means choosing to move forward even when it is scary. It means putting your armor back on and facing the world again." She stood up and held out her hand to shake his. "It was really nice playing cards with you, Daniel. I hope I get to do it again sometime. Maybe next time, you will let me win at least once." Daniel smiled, just a small flicker, but it was there. He shook her hand. After Dr. Chen left, Marcus found Rosa in the kitchen preparing lunch. "What did you think of her?" he asked. "I think she is very wise," Rosa said. She did not try to fix him. She just showed him another way of seeing himself. "Do you think it will help?" Rosa considered the question. "I think Daniel already knows what he needs to do. He just needs to decide he is ready to do it." That night, Rosa was in her small apartment above the garage, the cozy space she had made her own with photographs of her children and grandchildren, colorful blankets from home, and the smell of cinnamon and coffee. She was preparing for bed when she heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Daniel standing in the hallway, still wrapped in his blanket but with something clutched in his hand. It was the white handkerchief she had given him weeks ago. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice small. "Of course," Rosa said, stepping aside. Daniel entered and looked around her small space with curiosity. It was so different from the vast, cold elegance of the main house. It was warm and lived in and full of personality. "I like it here," Daniel said. "It feels safe." "Thank you," Rosa said. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" Daniel nodded, and Rosa busied herself in her small kitchenette, heating milk on the stove and stirring in cocoa powder and a touch of cinnamon. She poured 2 mugs and handed one to Daniel, who sat on her small couch, his blanket pulled around him. They sipped their chocolate in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Daniel spoke. "Rosa, when you were little and you tore your dress, how long did you sit naked before your mom made you the new one?" "Maybe 4 or 5 hours," Rosa said. "But it felt like forever." "Were you scared?" "I was ashamed," Rosa said. "And yes, a little scared. I thought I had done something unforgivable." "But you hadn't." "No, I had not. I was just a child who made a mistake." Daniel set down his mug and unfolded the handkerchief, spreading it on his lap. His fingers traced the blue embroidery along the edges. "My mom used to embroider," he said quietly. "She made me a pillowcase with my name on it. I sleep on it every night." "That is beautiful," Rosa said. "It is like she is tucking you in." "Rosa, I think I want to get dressed tomorrow." Rosa's heart swelled, but she kept her expression calm and supportive. "That is a big decision," she said. "Are you sure?" "I'm scared," Daniel admitted. "What if I put clothes on and I still feel dirty? What if nothing changes?" "Then we will figure it out together," Rosa said firmly. "But Daniel, I do not think you will feel dirty anymore. I think you have done the hard work of feeling your feelings and telling your truth. The dirt was never on your skin. It was in your heart. And hearts can be washed clean with tears and time and love." Daniel looked at her, this woman who had walked into his life with her gentle wisdom and patient presence, and he knew she was right. He was ready. Not because anyone had forced him or shamed him or bribed him, but because he had finally worked through the layers of guilt and grief that had kept him frozen. He was ready to be brave again. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning, will you help me get dressed?" "It would be my honor," Rosa said, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. Daniel finished his hot chocolate, gave Rosa a quick, impulsive hug, and then hurried back to the main house, his blanket trailing behind him like a cape. Rosa stood in her doorway watching him go, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel hope that was not tentative or guarded but full and bright and certain. Tomorrow, Daniel Montgomery would put on clothes. But more than that, he would put on his armor. He would choose to face the world again. And Rosa would be there, just as her mother had been there for her so many years ago, helping him button up his courage and step back into his life. The Montgomery estate was quiet that night, but it was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of grief and isolation. It was the peaceful quiet of healing, of a family slowly finding its way back to each other, one brave choice at a time. Morning arrived at the Montgomery estate with a golden softness that seemed almost orchestrated, as if the universe itself understood the significance of the day. Rosa was awake before dawn, as was her habit, but today her usual calm efficiency was tinged with nervous anticipation. She prepared breakfast with extra care, making buttermilk pancakes from scratch, the way her grandmother had taught her, and setting out fresh strawberries and Royale maple syrup. She brewed coffee for Marcus and herself, and prepared a pot of chamomile tea, Daniel's favorite. She kept glancing at the clock, wondering if he would change his mind, if the courage he had summoned the night before would evaporate in the harsh light of morning. It would not be the first time a child had promised something in an emotional moment only to retreat when faced with actually doing it. Rosa had learned not to hold children to declarations made in vulnerability. Healing moved in spirals, not straight lines. But at 7:30, right on schedule, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wrapped in his blanket but with an expression of determined nervousness that reminded Rosa achingly of her own son before his first day of kindergarten. "Good morning," Rosa said warmly, as if this were any other morning. "I made pancakes. Are you hungry?" Daniel nodded and climbed into his usual chair at the breakfast table. Rosa served him a stack with strawberries arranged in a smiley face on top, another trick from her mothering arsenal. He ate slowly, methodically, clearly stalling but also clearly committed to going through with his plan. Marcus appeared halfway through breakfast, already dressed for work in one of his impeccable suits, but he paused when he saw his son at the table. There was something different in the air, a tension that was not unpleasant but electric with possibility. "Morning," Marcus said carefully, pouring himself coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Okay," Daniel replied, then after a pause added, "Dad, I need to ask you something." Marcus sat down immediately, giving his son his full attention in a way he had failed to do for years. "Anything. Do you still have Mom's things? Like, her clothes and stuff?" Marcus's expression flickered with pain, but he nodded. "Yes. Everything is still in her closet. I couldn't bring myself to sort through it. Can I see them? After breakfast?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Rosa, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Of course. We can go together." The meal continued in charged silence. When Daniel finally pushed his plate away, having eaten more than Rosa had seen him consume in months, he took a deep breath and looked at both adults. "I'm ready now," he said simply. Rosa stood and held out her hand. Daniel took it, his small fingers wrapping around hers with a trust that made her chest tight. Marcus followed them upstairs, his usual confident stride replaced with something more hesitant, as if he were approaching sacred ground. Victoria's room had been left untouched since her death, a museum to a life cut short. Marcus opened the door for the first time in over a year, and dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The room still smelled faintly of her perfume, a scent that hit Daniel with such force that he stumbled slightly. Rosa steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. "Take your time," she murmured. Daniel walked slowly to his mother's closet, a walk-in space the size of most people's bedrooms. Clothes hung in neat rows, organized by color and season. Shoes lined the walls in perfect pairs. Scarves and belts hung from specialized racks. It was overwhelming in its abundance, but also heartbreaking in its stillness. These clothes would never be worn again. This woman would never return to choose an outfit for the day. Daniel stood in the center of the closet, turning slowly, taking it all in. Then his eyes landed on something hanging near the back, and he moved toward it with sudden purpose. It was a riding jacket, deep burgundy with leather patches on the elbows, worn soft from years of use. Daniel reached up and touched it, his fingers barely able to reach the hem. "She wore this the day she died," Marcus said quietly from the doorway. "It was her favorite. She said it brought her luck." Daniel pulled the jacket off its hanger with some difficulty and held it to his chest. It was far too large for him, the sleeves hanging past his hands, but he clutched it like a lifeline. "I want to wear something of hers," he said, his voice muffled by the fabric. "When I get dressed. I want part of her to be with me." Rosa felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was not a moment for her emotions. This was Daniel's moment. Marcus knelt down to his son's level, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think that's perfect," he said, his voice rough. "She would love that. But maybe we should find something that fits you a little better. How about this?" He reached up to a shelf and pulled down a soft cashmere scarf in deep purple, one of Victoria's favorites. He wrapped it gently around Daniel's neck. "There," Marcus said. "Now she's with you." Daniel touched the scarf, his fingers tracing the soft fibers, and nodded. He looked at Rosa. "I'm ready to see my clothes now." They walked together to Daniel's room, which had become a strange space over the past 2 years. His closet was still full of clothes he had outgrown, things purchased before the accident that no longer fit. His drawers contained pajamas and underwear that had never been worn, tags still attached, bought by well-meaning staff members in hopes that he might change his mind. Rosa opened the closet and began pulling items out, assessing sizes. Most were too small. Daniel had grown despite his ordeal, his body continuing its march toward adolescence even as his mind had been frozen in grief. "We will need to go shopping," Rosa observed practically. "Most of these will not fit anymore. But for today, let us find something comfortable." She found a pair of soft cotton pajama pants that Marcus had ordered months ago in a larger size, hoping Daniel might eventually wear them. They were navy blue with little white stars. She also found a simple white t-shirt that would be slightly big but wearable. "How about these?" she asked, holding them up. Daniel stared at the clothes as if they were foreign objects, artifacts from a life he barely remembered. His hands were trembling. "What if I can't do it?" he whispered. "What if I put them on and I start to feel bad again?" Rosa set the clothes down and knelt in front of him, taking both his hands in hers. "Then you take them off," she said firmly. "Daniel, there is no rule that says once you get dressed, you can never be naked again. You are in control. If wearing clothes makes you uncomfortable, you can take them off. But I think you will find that the discomfort you felt before, that feeling of being dirty, it is not going to come back. Because you have done the work. You have cried your tears. You have spoken your truth. You have let your father back in. The clothes are not what made you feel bad. The grief did. And you are learning to carry that grief differently now." Daniel nodded slowly, processing her words. He looked at his father, who was standing near the doorway, giving them space but remaining present. "Dad, will you stay?" Daniel asked. "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus promised. Rosa handed Daniel the underwear first, simple white briefs. He took them with shaking hands and stared at them for a long moment. Then, with a movement that seemed to require every ounce of courage he possessed, he let his blanket drop to the floor. For the first time in 732 days, Daniel stood completely exposed by choice, not by defiance. The vulnerability of the moment was enormous. Rosa and Marcus both held their breath, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell was allowing this to happen. Daniel stepped into the underwear and pulled them up. He stood very still, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. When nothing did, he took the pajama pants from Rosa and put them on as well. Then the t-shirt. And finally, with careful reverence, he adjusted the purple scarf around his neck. He was dressed. Rosa's hands flew to her mouth, tears finally spilling over despite her best efforts to remain composed. Marcus made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and crossed the room in 3 strides to wrap his son in an embrace so fierce it lifted Daniel off his feet. "I'm so proud of you," Marcus choked out. "So incredibly proud." Daniel hugged him back, really hugged him, for the first time in years. When Marcus finally set him down, Daniel turned to Rosa with an expression of wonder and relief. "I don't feel dirty," he said, amazed. "I thought I would, but I don't." "Because you were never dirty," Rosa said, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. "You were just hurting. And now you are healing." Daniel looked down at himself, at the clothes that covered his body, at the scarf that connected him to his mother. He took a few experimental steps, as if relearning how to move in fabric. Then he did something that made both adults catch their breath. He smiled. It was small and tentative, but it was genuine. "Can we have more pancakes?" he asked. "I'm still hungry." Rosa laughed, a joyful sound that filled the room. "We can have as many pancakes as you want." The 3 of them returned to the kitchen, and Rosa made another batch while Marcus called his office to cancel all his meetings for the day. For the first time in his career, something was more important than work. His son was more important than work. They spent the morning together, doing simple, ordinary things that felt extraordinary in their normalcy. Marcus taught Daniel how to play chess, a game Victoria had loved. Rosa taught them both how to make her grandmother's empanadas, and they laughed as flour dusted the pristine kitchen and Daniel's attempts at folding the dough resulted in lumpy, misshapen creations that Rosa assured him would taste delicious regardless. Around noon, the doorbell rang. Marcus answered it to find Dr. Chen standing on the doorstep with a wrapped package under her arm. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by," she said. "I was in the neighborhood, and I wanted to drop this off for Daniel." Marcus invited her in, and she followed him to the kitchen where she stopped short at the sight of Daniel, fully clothed and covered in flour, standing on a stool next to Rosa as they worked on the empanadas. "Well," Dr. Chen said, her face breaking into a huge smile. "Look at you." Daniel turned and grinned at her, a real grin that showed teeth. "I got dressed," he announced proudly. I can see that. And you look very handsome. Is that a special scarf? Daniel touched the purple cashmere. It was my mom's. Rosa said I could wear something of hers to keep her close. That's beautiful, Dr. Chen said sincerely. She held out the package. I brought you something. It's not much, just a little gift to celebrate new beginnings. Daniel climbed down from the stool and took the package, tearing into the wrapping paper with the enthusiasm of a child who had rediscovered the joy of surprises. Inside was a book, a beautiful illustrated edition of Where the Wild Things Are. My mom used to read this to me, Daniel said softly, running his fingers over the cover. I know, Dr. Chen said. Your dad told me. I thought maybe you could read it again, but this time, you could read it yourself. You're older now. You might see things in it you didn't see before. Daniel clutched the book to his chest, right next to the scarf. Thank you. Dr. Chen stayed for lunch, eating misshapen empanadas that were indeed delicious despite their appearance, and watching as Daniel slowly emerged from his shell. He asked questions, made jokes, spilled his drink and laughed about it instead of retreating into silence. He was, Rosa realized with a full heart, acting like a regular 8-year-old boy for the first time in years. After Dr. Chen left, Marcus made another phone call, this one to the principal of Daniel's former school. I'd like to discuss Daniel returning in the fall, Marcus said, his voice confident in a way it hadn't been when discussing his son in years. Yes, he's made significant progress. Actually, he's made a complete breakthrough. I think with the right support, he'll be ready. Daniel, overhearing the conversation, felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. School meant other children, meant explaining where he had been, meant facing questions he might not want to answer. But he also felt something else, something that had been absent for so long. Excitement. The possibility of friends, of normalcy, of a future that extended beyond the walls of his room. That evening, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and pinks visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the household gathered in the living room, a space that had been largely unused for years. Marcus sat in his favorite leather chair. Rosa settled on the sofa with her ever-present book, though tonight she was not reading it. And Daniel, dressed in his star-covered pajamas with his mother's scarf still around his neck, curled up between them with his new copy of Where the Wild Things Are. Will you read it out loud? Marcus asked his son gently. Daniel nodded and opened to the first page. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another, he began, his voice clear and strong. His mother called him Wild Thing and Max said, I'll eat you up, so he was sent to bed without eating anything. As Daniel read the familiar story of a boy who sailed away to a land of monsters and eventually chose to return home to where someone loved him best of all, Rosa thought about journeys and armor and the courage it took to face the world after it had wounded you. She thought about her own mother, long gone but never forgotten, whose wisdom about clothes and protection had traveled across decades and borders to help another child in need. Marcus listened to his son's voice, really listened, and marveled at how close he had come to losing this. Not to death, like Victoria, but to his own fear and inability to see past his grief. He had almost let his son disappear into silence because he had been too consumed by his own pain to recognize Daniel's. But Rosa had seen. Rosa had understood. And Rosa had saved them both. When Daniel finished the story, he closed the book and looked up at the adults who flanked him. I think I understand this book better now, he said thoughtfully. Max went to Where the Wild Things Are because he was angry and needed to work through his feelings. And the wild things made him king because they saw his pain. But in the end, he wanted to go home because he knew he was loved. That's what I did, kind of. I went somewhere wild and scary in my head. But you guys helped me find my way home. Rosa reached over and squeezed his hand. That is exactly right, Mijo. And home will always be here, waiting for you, no matter how wild things get. The next few weeks unfolded with a gentleness that felt like grace. Daniel continued to wear clothes, though he kept his mother's scarf with him always, a talisman of love and remembrance. Marcus scaled back his work hours dramatically, shocking his business partners but refusing to negotiate. His son needed him, and for the first time, Marcus understood that being present was more valuable than being powerful. Rosa remained their anchor, the steady heartbeat of the household. She cooked meals that brought them together. She told stories that helped Daniel understand his own. She maintained boundaries and routines that provided structure without rigidity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Montgomery house transformed from a mausoleum of grief into a home where laughter echoed off the marble floors and love warmed the cold, perfect spaces. Daniel began seeing Dr. Chen regularly, not because there was something wrong with him but because talking to someone trained in navigating difficult emotions was helpful. He joined a grief support group for children who had lost parents, and discovered he was not alone in his particular brand of pain. He made a friend, a girl named Sophie whose father had died of cancer, and they would sit together drawing pictures and sharing their stories without judgment or pity. Shopping for new clothes became an adventure rather than a trauma. Marcus took Daniel to the mall, something he had not done since Victoria died, and they spent an entire Saturday trying on jeans and t-shirts and sneakers. Daniel gravitated towards soft fabrics and muted colors, nothing scratchy or restrictive, and Marcus bought everything his son wanted without comment on price or practicality. They came home with bags full of new clothes and stopped for ice cream on the way, sitting in the car eating their cones and talking about nothing and everything. Rosa watched all of this unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted a seed and watched it grow into something beautiful. She had not set out to be a miracle worker. She had simply shown up with her own scars and her own wisdom and offered them freely to a child who needed them. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after Daniel had first gotten dressed, he found Rosa in the garden pruning the rose bushes. He stood watching her for a moment, this woman who had changed his life without even trying. "Rosa," he said, and she turned to him with her warm smile. "Yes, me Joe? I wanted to give you something." He held out a small box, wrapped somewhat clumsily in tissue paper. Rosa wiped her hands on her apron and took it, touched by the gesture. "You did not need to get me anything," she said. "I wanted to." "Open it." Rosa unwrapped the box to find a delicate silver chain with a small pendant. The pendant was in the shape of a dress, simple and elegant, with tiny blue stones set into it. She looked at Daniel, confused and moved. "I asked Dad to help me design it," Daniel explained, suddenly shy. "It's supposed to be like the dress your mom made you." "The blue stones are sapphires," Dad said. "They're the same color as the thread your mom used to embroider." Rosa's vision blurred with tears. She had told that story to help him, never expecting anything in return, certainly not something so thoughtful and precious. "Daniel, this is too expensive." "I cannot accept, please," Daniel interrupted, his voice earnest. "You gave me back my life. You helped me find my armor again. I wanted to give you something that reminds you that your story mattered. That your mom's love for you mattered. And that you passing that love on to me mattered most of all." Rosa pulled him into a fierce hug, this boy who had been so lost and was now so found. "It is the most beautiful gift I have ever received," she whispered into his hair. "Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for letting me be part of your journey. Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered back. They stood there in the garden, surrounded by roses that Victoria had planted years ago, and for a moment, it felt like she was there too, watching over the son she had loved and the woman who had helped him heal. That evening, Marcus found Rosa in the kitchen preparing dinner. He cleared his throat awkwardly, and she looked up from the vegetables she was chopping. "I saw Daniel give you the necklace," Marcus said. "I hope it was okay that I helped him with it. He was very specific about what he wanted." "It is perfect," Rosa said, her hand going to the pendant now hanging around her neck. "He is a special boy." "He is," Marcus agreed. "Thanks to you." "Not just me," Rosa corrected. "You have shown up for him. You have done the hard work too." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then spoke with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I was thinking about offering you a different position. Not as a housekeeper, but as a family manager. Better pay, better hours, more responsibility. Daniel trusts you." "I trust you." And I think, if you're willing, we could use your wisdom in more than just the kitchen and the hallways." Rosa considered this. She had grown to love this strange, wounded family. She had found purpose here beyond simple housekeeping. But she also valued her independence, her autonomy. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need." 2 days later, Rosa gave him her answer. Yes, but with conditions. She would manage the household and continue to be a presence in Daniel's life, but she would also maintain her own space and her own time. She would not be available 24 hours a day. She had her own family, her own life, and those boundaries were not negotiable. Marcus agreed immediately, even increasing her proposed salary. He was learning, slowly but surely, that the most valuable things in life could not be bought or controlled. They could only be honored and protected. Summer arrived with long, golden days and warm evenings. Daniel started a day camp for children interested in art, something he had shown a talent for in his therapy sessions. He made friends, real friends who knew nothing about his past and saw only the creative, thoughtful boy he was becoming. He still had hard days, days when grief would hit him like a wave and he would need to retreat to his room with his mother's scarf. But those days became less frequent, and he learned to ride them out with the support of his father and Rosa. On the 2-year anniversary of the day Daniel had first gotten dressed again, the family gathered for a special dinner. Rosa had prepared all of Daniel's favorite foods, a feast of flavors and love. They ate together at the large dining room table that had collected dust for so long, and after dinner, Marcus stood up with a glass of sparkling cider. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice steady and full of emotion. "2 years ago, my son found the courage to face the world again. And in doing so, he taught me how to be brave too. Daniel, I am so proud of the young man you're becoming. Your mother would be proud too." He turned to Rosa. "And Rosa, you came into our lives when we were at our lowest, and you didn't try to fix us or change us. You just loved us where we were and showed us a path forward. You saved us, and there are no words big enough to thank you for that." Rosa shook her head, embarrassed by the praise, but Daniel raised his own glass. "To Rosa," he said firmly. "The best person I know." They clinked their glasses together, and in that moment, surrounded by love and laughter and the ghosts of grief that had finally been laid to rest, they were not a broken family held together by obligation and professional help. They were simply a family, imperfect and healing and whole. The story of the boy who would not wear clothes became, in time, a story they would tell about resilience and recovery. It became a reminder that healing is not linear, that everyone needs their own path through pain, and that sometimes the most profound interventions come not from expensive specialists or clinical techniques but from simple human compassion and the wisdom of lived experience. Rosa never forgot her own mother's lesson about clothes as armor, and she passed it on not just to Daniel but to everyone who needed to hear it. Clothes are how we show the world we are ready to face it, but first, we have to be ready ourselves. And that readiness comes not from pressure or shame or force, but from love, patience, and the courage to be vulnerable enough to heal. Daniel kept his mother's scarf for the rest of his life. Even as he grew into adolescence and then adulthood, even as he went to college and started his own career, he kept it in a special box along with the handkerchief Rosa had given him and the book Dr. Chen had brought him. They were relics of the time he had been lost and then found, reminders that even in our darkest moments, there are people who will sit with us in the darkness and help us find our way back to the light. And Rosa, wearing her silver pendant with its tiny dress and blue sapphires, continued to move through the world with her quiet strength and gentle wisdom, touching lives in ways she would never fully know, carrying her mother's legacy of love forward into a world that desperately needed it. 5 years had passed since the morning Daniel Montgomery first chose to dress himself again, and the transformation that had begun in those fragile moments had rippled outward in ways none of them could have anticipated. The Montgomery estate, once a monument to grief and isolation, had become something entirely different. It had become a home in the truest sense, filled with the messy vitality of real life rather than the sterile perfection of wealth on display. Daniel was 13 now, on the cusp of that awkward transition between boyhood and adolescence. He had grown tall, his frame filling out with the promise of his father's build, though his eyes retained a gentleness that Marcus had never possessed at that age. He attended Riverside Academy again, having returned in 5th grade to a surprisingly warm reception. The other students, briefed by understanding teachers and counselors, had treated his return not with mockery or curiosity but with the casual acceptance that children often display when adults give them permission to be kind. He had discovered a passion for photography, spending hours capturing images of the world around him through a lens that seemed to help him process emotions he still sometimes struggled to express in words. His room, no longer the barren cell of his suffering years, was plastered with photographs he had taken and developed himself in the darkroom Marcus had built for him in the basement. Pictures of Rosa kneading bread, her hands dusted with flour and her face concentrated. Pictures of his father laughing at something on his phone, caught in an unguarded moment. Pictures of the garden where his mother had planted roses, now wild and abundant and more beautiful for their lack of rigid control. The scarf, Victoria's purple cashmere, no longer hung around his neck every day. It had been carefully folded and placed in a shadow box along with a photograph of his mother on horseback, her head thrown back in laughter. The box hung on his bedroom wall where he could see it every morning when he woke and every night before he slept. He had learned that carrying his mother with him did not require a physical talisman. She lived in his choices, in his kindness, in the way he treated others with the same grace she had shown the world. Marcus had changed perhaps even more dramatically than his son. The man who had once measured his worth in square footage and profit margins had discovered that true wealth had nothing to do with his bank account. He had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his company, promoting a capable executive to CEO while he remained chairman of the board. This gave him the flexibility to be present for Daniel in ways that mattered, attending school plays and parent-teacher conferences and weekend camping trips where they would sleep in a tent and tell stories by firelight. He had also begun dating again, something that had terrified both him and Daniel when it first came up. Her name was Catherine, a warm, unpretentious woman who taught literature at the local community college. She had met Marcus at a fundraiser for childhood literacy and had been utterly unimpressed by his wealth and status, which had intrigued him more than any of the society women who had pursued him over the years. Catherine had met Daniel 6 months into the relationship, and the boy had circled her warily like a cat assessing a stranger. But she had not tried too hard, had not attempted to replace his mother or force affection. She had simply been herself, steady and genuine, and gradually Daniel had warmed to her presence. Rosa had watched this courtship with her characteristic quiet wisdom, offering neither approval nor disapproval but simply being available when Marcus needed to process his feelings. She had become far more than an employee in the Montgomery household. She was family, the kind chosen rather than inherited, and her presence had become as essential as oxygen. Her role had indeed evolved beyond housekeeping, though she still cooked the meals that brought them together and maintained the spaces where they lived. She had become a confidant to Marcus, a mentor to Daniel, and a bridge between the painful past and the hopeful future. Her own children visited regularly now, bringing Rosa's grandchildren to play in the vast gardens and swim in the pool that had once been exclusively ornamental. The sound of children's laughter echoing through the estate had become commonplace, a symphony of joy that would have been unthinkable in the dark years. But Rosa knew that healing was not a destination but a journey, and that journey sometimes circled back to face old demons in new forms. She saw the signs before anyone else did, the small retreats and hesitations that suggested Daniel was struggling with something he had not yet found words for. It began with the approaching anniversary. 8 years since Victoria's death. Daniel had been working on a photography project for school, a series exploring the theme of loss and memory. He had spent weeks in the darkroom, emerging with prints that were haunting and beautiful, images of empty spaces and shadow figures that spoke to the hollowness grief carves out of the world. His teacher had praised the work, calling it mature beyond his years, but Rosa had seen the cost of creating it in the shadows under Daniel's eyes and the way he picked at his food during meals. One evening, Rosa found him sitting alone in the garden at dusk, in the same spot where Victoria's favorite roses grew. He was not crying, but there was a heaviness to his posture that concerned her. She approached slowly, giving him the option to send her away if he needed solitude, but he looked up and offered a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "Can I sit?" Rosa asked, and Daniel nodded. They sat in comfortable silence for a long while, watching as the last light faded from the sky and the automatic garden lights flickered on, casting everything in a soft amber glow. "Do you think it gets easier?" Daniel asked finally, his voice quiet. "Missing someone?" Rosa considered the question carefully. Daniel was old enough now for truth without cushioning. "No," she said honestly. "It does not get easier. But it changes. At first, grief is like wearing a coat made of lead. Every movement is exhausting, and you cannot imagine ever taking it off. But over time, the coat gets lighter. Not because the grief is less, but because you get stronger. You learn how to carry it. Some days it still feels heavy, and that is okay. That is normal." "I thought I was done with the hard part," Daniel admitted. "I thought once I got through those first years, once I could talk about her without falling apart, I would be okay. But lately, I've been having these dreams where I can't remember her face. And when I wake up, I panic and run to look at her pictures because what if I forget? What if she just becomes this idea instead of a real person I loved?" Rosa reached over and took his hand, her calloused fingers warm against his. "You will never forget her," she said firmly. "Not truly. But our memories do change over time. We remember feelings more than details. We remember how someone made us feel more than the exact sound of their laugh. And that is not forgetting, Mijo. That is the natural way our hearts protect themselves from being constantly wounded by what we have lost." "It feels like betrayal," Daniel whispered. "Like I'm letting her go." "No," Rosa said, squeezing his hand. "You are letting yourself grow. Your mother would want that. She would want you to have a full life, even if she cannot be physically present for it. Remembering her does not mean staying frozen in the moment you lost her. It means carrying forward the love she gave you and letting it shape who you become." Daniel leaned his head against Rosa's shoulder, seeking the comfort he had found there so many times before. "How do you do it?" he asked. "You lost your husband. You told me once about losing your mother. How do you keep going without being angry all the time?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment, watching a moth flutter around one of the garden lights. "I was angry," she said finally. "When my husband died, I was so angry I thought I would choke on it. Angry at him for being careless, angry at the company that did not have proper safety equipment, angry at God for taking him from me and our children. That anger lived in my chest like a fire, and for a while, I fed it because it was easier to be angry than to be sad." "What changed?" "My daughter," Rosa said. "She was 7 when her father died, and one day I found her in her room, punching her pillow and screaming. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she was angry like Mama. She said if I could be angry all the time, then she could too. And seeing my pain reflected back at me through my child's eyes, that is what broke me open. I realized I was teaching her that anger was the only acceptable response to loss. So I made a choice. I chose to let the anger go and make room for gratitude instead." "Gratitude?" Daniel sounded skeptical. "Yes," Rosa said. "Gratitude that I had loved someone worth grieving. Gratitude for the years we did have, even though they were not enough. Gratitude that my children existed because of that love. It did not make the pain disappear, but it made the pain bearable. It gave me a reason to keep going that was not just about surviving but about honoring what I had been given." Daniel absorbed this, his young mind working through the complexity of adult emotions. "I want to honor Mom," he said. "But I don't know how." "You already do," Rosa assured him. "Every time you choose kindness over cruelty, every time you create something beautiful with your camera, every time you let yourself be vulnerable enough to ask for help, you honor her. She lives on through you, Daniel. Through the person you are becoming." They sat together until full dark had fallen and Marcus came looking for them, calling their names with a hint of worry in his voice. When he found them in the garden, Rosa and Daniel sitting side by side in the amber light, he felt a rush of gratitude so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. This woman, this remarkable woman who had walked into their lives with nothing but her own hard-won wisdom and bottomless compassion, had saved them both. She had taught them how to grieve, how to heal, and how to live again. The photography project became something more than a school assignment. Daniel expanded it, spending months conducting interviews with people who had experienced significant loss. He talked to war veterans, to parents who had lost children, to elderly people who had outlived their spouses. He photographed them in their homes, in their environments, and paired each portrait with their words about grief and survival and what made life worth living despite the pain. Rosa agreed to be one of his subjects. She sat for him in her small apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of her life, photographs of her children and grandchildren, the silver pendant Daniel had given her years ago resting against her chest. He asked her questions he had never thought to ask before. About her journey from El Salvador, about building a life from nothing, about the losses she had endured and the joys she had claimed despite them. "What is the most important thing you have learned?" Daniel asked, his camera clicking as he captured her weathered hands folded in her lap, the late afternoon light streaming through the window behind her. Rosa thought about this for a long time before answering. "That we are not meant to carry our burdens alone," she said finally. "God, the universe, whatever you believe in, it creates communities for a reason. We are meant to lean on each other, to share our weight, to let others help us carry what we cannot manage ourselves. Pride tells us we should be strong enough to handle everything on our own. But wisdom tells us that asking for help is its own kind of strength." Daniel lowered his camera and looked at her, this woman who had become the grandmother he had never known, the mother figure who had appeared precisely when he needed her most. "You saved my life," he said simply. "You know that, right?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "You reminded me why I do this work. Why I open my heart even when it is risky. You reminded me that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply showing up and bearing witness to someone else's pain without trying to fix it or rush it or diminish it." The project won several awards when Daniel finally exhibited it at a local gallery the following spring. The opening reception was packed with people moving slowly through the exhibition, pausing before each portrait, reading the accompanying stories of loss and resilience. Marcus stood next to Catherine, his arm around her waist, watching his son navigate the crowd with a confidence and grace that would have seemed impossible 8 years ago. Rosa stood in front of her own portrait, listening as strangers read her words and commented on the wisdom in them. A young woman approached her, her eyes red from crying as she moved through the exhibition. "Excuse me," the woman said hesitantly. "Are you the Rosa from this portrait?" "I am," Rosa confirmed. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother died 6 months ago, and I've been drowning in grief, feeling like I'm never going to surface. But reading your words about carrying burdens together, about asking for help being a strength, it gave me permission to stop pretending I'm okay when I'm not. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your story." Rosa embraced the stranger, this young woman whose pain was still so fresh and raw, and felt the ancient truth settle over her once again. Our stories matter. Our struggles matter. The wisdom earned through suffering can light the way for others stumbling through their own darkness. As spring turned to summer, the Montgomery household prepared for another significant milestone. Daniel would be graduating from 8th grade, preparing to enter high school in the fall. Marcus and Catherine had gotten engaged, with Catherine moving into the estate and bringing her own warmth and quirks to the space. She was an avid gardener, and she and Rosa had formed an alliance of sorts, working together to expand the rose garden Victoria had started and adding vegetables and herbs that Catherine used in her cooking experiments. Daniel had been asked to give a speech at his graduation, something he had initially resisted before Rosa convinced him that he had something valuable to say. She sat with him over several evenings as he drafted and revised, helping him find the words to express the journey he had traveled. On the day of graduation, the Montgomery family arrived together, Marcus and Catherine, Rosa and her daughter Maria who had taken time off from her nursing shift to attend, and even Rosa's son Miguel who had driven up from San Diego where he taught high school. They filled an entire row, this chosen family that had formed around a boy who had once been lost and was now so clearly found. When Daniel's name was called to give his speech, he walked to the podium with his mother's scarf folded carefully in his pocket, a private talisman for courage. He looked out at the sea of faces, parents and students and teachers, and took a deep breath. When I was 8 years old, he began, his voice steady, I went through something that I thought would define me forever. I thought I would always be the kid who broke, who couldn't handle what life threw at him. But I was lucky enough to have people in my life who taught me that breaking is not the end of the story. It's just a chapter, and we get to decide what comes next. He spoke about grief and healing, about the importance of asking for help, about how the things that wound us can also make us more compassionate toward others who are suffering. He spoke about his mother and the legacy of love she had left behind, and how honoring that legacy meant living fully rather than being paralyzed by loss. I want to thank the people who saved me, Daniel said, his eyes finding Rosa in the audience. The professionals who gave me tools and strategies, yes, but more importantly, the people who simply showed up. Who sat with me in my pain without trying to rush me through it. Who shared their own stories so I would know I wasn't alone. Who loved me even when I was difficult to love. His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed through. We live in a world that tells us to be strong, to be independent, to handle our problems alone. But the truth is that we need each other. We need people who will see us at our worst and not turn away. We need people who will remind us who we are when we have forgotten. We need people brave enough to be vulnerable, to share their scars, and to say me too when we are drowning in shame and isolation. The auditorium was completely silent, every eye fixed on this young man who was speaking truths most adults struggled to articulate. So as we leave middle school and move forward into high school and beyond, I want to challenge all of us to be those people for each other. To show up. To listen. To share our struggles instead of pretending we have it all figured out. Because I promise you, the moments that will matter most in your life will not be the ones where you succeeded alone. They will be the moments where you let someone help you, and the moments where you help someone else. That is what it means to be human. That is what it means to truly live. The applause that erupted was thunderous, a standing ovation that went on for so long the principal finally had to step forward and gently usher Daniel back to his seat. But Daniel barely heard it. His eyes were locked on Rosa, who was crying openly, her hands pressed to her heart. She mouthed 2 words to him across the distance, I'm proud. That night, they celebrated at the estate with a dinner that was part formal affair and part joyful chaos. Rosa had prepared a feast, and the table that had once stood empty and dust-covered now groaned under the weight of food and was surrounded by laughter and conversation. Catherine told stories about her own awkward adolescence that had everyone in stitches. Marcus shared memories of Victoria that were tender but no longer agonizing, integrating her into the present rather than locking her away in the painful past. Rosa's grandchildren chased each other through the garden while the adults lingered over coffee and dessert. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Daniel found Rosa on the terrace overlooking the garden. She was standing at the railing, her face tilted up toward the stars. Quite a day, Rosa said as Daniel joined her. Yeah, Daniel agreed. Rosa, I meant what I said in my speech. About you saving me. I need you to know that. I know, Mijo, Rosa said, reaching over to pat his hand. But you saved yourself. I just helped you remember how. Will you always be here? Daniel asked, and there was a vulnerability in the question that took Rosa back to the 8-year-old boy who had first wrapped himself in a blanket and refused to face the world. I mean, I know I'm getting older and I won't need you the same way. But will you still be part of our family? Rosa turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. Daniel Montgomery, listen to me carefully. I will be part of this family until the day I die. You are stuck with me, do you understand? When you graduate high school, I will be there. When you go to college, I will send you care packages full of my empanadas. When you get married someday, I will be in the front row crying happy tears. When you have children of your own, I will teach them to make pozole and tell them embarrassing stories about their father. You are not getting rid of me. Daniel pulled her into a fierce hug, this boy who had grown almost as tall as his father, and Rosa held him, marveling as she always did at the resilience of the human spirit. "Thank you," Daniel whispered. "For everything." "Thank you," Rosa whispered back, "for reminding me why love is always worth the risk." They stood together on the terrace as night deepened around them, two souls who had found each other at exactly the right moment and had changed each other's lives in ways neither would ever fully comprehend. Behind them, through the windows, the Montgomery house glowed with light and life, no longer a fortress of grief but a sanctuary of hope. The story of the boy who would not wear clothes had become a story about courage and connection, about the healing power of shared vulnerability and the wisdom that comes from surviving what we thought would destroy us. It was a story about a housekeeper who saw a child in pain and offered him the gift of her own scars, trusting that sometimes the best medicine is knowing you are not alone. But more than anything, it was a story about love. The fierce protective love of a grieving father learning to be present. The romantic love that blooms after loss and teaches us that our hearts are more expansive than we knew. The familial love that transcends blood and employment and circumstance. And the quiet, steady love of a woman who showed up every day with her book and her stories and her unshakable faith that broken things can be made whole again. Years later, when Daniel was asked in a college application essay to write about someone who had influenced him profoundly, he wrote about Rosa. He described her calloused hands and her warm smile, her grandmother's recipes and her mother's wisdom about clothes as armor. He wrote about how she had taught him that healing is not weakness, that asking for help is brave, and that the scars we earn from surviving our darkest moments become the light we offer others still finding their way. And in the conclusion, he wrote something that made the admissions officer who read it call her colleague over to share it, both women wiping tears from their eyes as they read, "Rosa Delgado did not fix me. She simply sat with me in my brokenness until I remembered how to fix myself." In a world that values quick solutions and easy answers, she offered me the radical gift of patience. She showed me that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone who is suffering is nothing more than staying. Just staying. Just being present. Just loving them exactly as they are while believing they have the strength to become who they need to be. That is the lesson I carry with me every day, and that is the person I hope to become. Someone who stays. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.